law is no longer merely being tested, but is, according to mounting allegations and sworn testimony, being quietly negotiated, leveraged, and in some cases seemingly traded away in back rooms far removed from public scrutiny. What if the warning signs are not buried in anonymous online forums or speculative talk shows, but instead appear in federal court filings, in transcripts from congressional hearings, and in sharply worded opinions issued by judges appointed by presidents of both parties? This is not framed as partisan theater, nor as campaign rhetoric designed to inflame voters in an election year. Rather, it is described by its critics as a sober accounting of documented claims, judicial findings, and statements made under oath, claims that suggest a dangerous convergence of power, influence, intimidation, and institutional silence at the highest levels of government. In this telling, America is not collapsing in a dramatic coup, but drifting incrementally and procedurally toward a concentration of executive authority that critics argue bypasses legislative guardrails and stretches constitutional limits to their breaking point. Since January, according to testimony delivered during formal congressional proceedings, the country has experienced what some lawmakers and legal scholars describe as an unprecedented expansion of executive power, an expansion achieved not primarily through new legislation debated openly in Congress, but through executive directives, aggressive enforcement actions, and administrative maneuvers that test the boundaries of statutory authority. Witnesses speaking before congressional committees have alleged that federal agencies are operating with a degree of autonomy and force that evokes comparisons not to stable democracies, but to governments where dissent is chilled through intimidation and the machinery of the state is deployed selectively. They describe communities where heavily armed federal personnel conduct operations in residential neighborhoods, where families report fear and confusion as tactical units execute warrants with a show of force that critics argue is disproportionate to the alleged offenses at issue. Civil liberties advocates have raised concerns about detentions carried out by agents whose accountability mechanisms are opaque to the public, arguing that transparency, long considered a cornerstone of American governance, is being eroded through secrecy and procedural complexity. Allegations have also surfaced, documented in court filings and media investigations, that some individuals have been wrongfully detained or deported, their cases mired in bureaucratic error or expedited processes that leave little room for meaningful appeal. These claims, supporters of reform emphasize, are not confined to ideological extremes. They have been voiced in formal settings, entered into the congressional record, and debated by elected officials under oath. At the same time, a deeper institutional critique has emerged that Congress, specifically members aligned with the administration, has failed to assert its constitutional prerogatives under Article 1, which vests legislative authority in the legislative branch precisely to prevent the concentration of unchecked executive power. According to this critique, rather than serving as a co-equal branch providing oversight and accountability, certain lawmakers have deferred to the executive, declining to issue subpoenas, pursue rigorous investigations, or challenge expansive interpretations of statutory authority. The charge is stark that loyalty to party leadership or to the president has in some cases eclipsed the institutional duty to defend the separation of powers. Meanwhile, the judiciary has become a battleground for these disputes. Federal judges, including several appointed by Republican presidents, have issued rulings rebuking aspects of administrative action, questioning whether agencies have exceeded the authority granted to them by Congress or have failed to adhere to procedural requirements mandated by law. In one notable opinion, a judge wrote that the court could not imagine how the public interest would be served by permitting federal officials to disregard the very statutes they are sworn to uphold, a line that critics cite as emblematic of the judiciary's alarm. Courtrooms across the country have become arenas in which emergency injunctions, stays, and expedited appeals unfold at a rapid pace, reflecting both the urgency and the volatility of the legal questions at stake. At issue are not only individual policies, but broader principles: the non-delegation doctrine, the limits of executive discretion, the due process rights of individuals facing government action, and the balance between national security prerogatives and civil liberties. Layered atop these constitutional debates are allegations of corruption and conflicts of interest that have further fueled public skepticism. References to sealed evidence, to materials associated with high-profile criminal investigations, and to claims of improper influence have circulated in media reports and political discourse, though such claims remain subject to ongoing legal scrutiny and dispute. The mention of controversial figures connected to past scandals, names that have already reshaped public trust in institutions, adds to the sense that unresolved questions linger at the intersection of wealth, access, and accountability. Critics argue that when investigations stall, when documents remain redacted, or when oversight appears inconsistent, the vacuum is filled with suspicion and cynicism. Supporters of the administration counter that many of these actions fall squarely within lawful executive authority, that aggressive enforcement reflects campaign promises implemented through legitimate channels, and that courts serve precisely to adjudicate disputes when disagreements arise. They contend that robust executive action as authoritarian overreach ignores the constitutional design that empowers the presidency to execute the laws and to respond swiftly to emergent challenges. Yet even this defense underscores the central tension: how much discretion is too much, and who ultimately decides. The framers of the Constitution anticipated ambition counteracting ambition. They envisioned a system in which each branch would jealously guard its prerogatives. When one branch appears to recede, whether out of political calculation or ideological alignment, the equilibrium shifts. Legal scholars note that democratic erosion rarely announces itself with fanfare. Instead, it often manifests through incremental normalization of extraordinary measures, justified by urgency or necessity. Emergency powers, once invoked, can become precedents. Temporary suspensions can harden into routine practice. Public fatigue can dull the impact of each successive controversy. In the current climate, public trust in institutions, Congress, the courts, federal law enforcement, has already been strained by years of polarization, misinformation, and high-profile investigations. When sworn testimony alleges misconduct or systemic abuse, and when judicial opinions question executive compliance with statutory mandates, the cumulative effect is a narrative of institutional stress. Whether that narrative reflects a genuine constitutional crisis or an intense but ultimately self-correcting political struggle remains contested. What is undeniable is that the mechanisms of accountability are being tested in real time. Congressional hearings become stages for stark accusations and procedural wrangling. Federal dockets swell with challenges to executive action. Advocacy groups mobilize supporters and file amicus briefs. Media outlets dissect each ruling, each leaked memo, each public statement. The American public, meanwhile, is left to parse complex legal arguments and to decide whom to trust. In a healthy constitutional system, transparency, oversight, and judicial review function not as signs of a weakness, but as evidence of resilience. But resilience depends on norms as much as on written text. It depends on officials honoring not only the letter of the law, but its spirit, on lawmakers prioritizing institutional integrity over short-term gain, on courts maintaining independence in the face of political pressure. The warnings voiced in court opinions and congressional testimony serve at minimum as reminders that the separation of powers is not self-enforcing. It requires vigilance, engagement, and an informed citizenry willing to scrutinize power regardless of party. As the debates continue, as appeals wind their way through higher courts, and as lawmakers confront choices about oversight and reform, the central question endures: Will the constitutional guardrails designed more than 2 centuries ago prove adaptable enough to contain modern concentrations of power? Or will precedents set in moments of political intensity redefine the contours of executive authority for generations to come? The answer will not be delivered in a single headline or hearing. It will emerge from the interplay of rulings, legislation, elections, and public judgment. For now, what stands before the country is not a tidy narrative, but a contested landscape in which allegations, defenses, and judicial interventions collide. The stakes, by nearly every account, are nothing less than the durability of the rule of law and the credibility of the institutions entrusted to uphold it. Another federal judge warned that allowing constitutional rights to hinge on the grace of the executive branch would amount to a dereliction of duty by the judiciary itself, a striking reminder that the courts exist not to ratify power, but to restrain it. In yet another sharply worded opinion, a judge wrote, "As is becoming far too common, we are confronted again with efforts of the executive branch to set aside the rule of law in pursuit of its own goals." The phrase "far too common" reverberated far beyond the courtroom, cited by critics as evidence of a pattern rather than an isolated dispute. To them, these rulings signal a judiciary increasingly alarmed by what it perceives as repeated boundary testing by the executive. To the defenders of the administration, they represent the ordinary friction of a constitutional system in which courts and the presidency regularly clash over the scope of authority. But the accumulation of such language, measured, formal, yet unmistakably concerned, has intensified a broader national debate about whether the balance of power is being recalibrated in ways the framers never intended. That debate deepened when attention returned to the long-casting shadow of Jeffrey Epstein. A widely circulated photograph showing former President Donald Trump alongside Epstein resurfaced in public discourse, reigniting questions that have lingered for years. Epstein, whose criminal enterprise involved the trafficking and abuse of underage girls, died in federal custody in 2019 while awaiting trial on additional charges. His network of associations, spanning celebrities, business leaders, academics, and politicians, has remained a source of intense public scrutiny. Court documents, depositions, and investigative reporting have documented various social connections, though the legal significance of many of those associations remains disputed. What continues to fuel controversy is not merely the existence of photographs or prior acquaintanceships, but the perception among some lawmakers and activists that key records tied to Epstein's activities have not been fully disclosed. Members of Congress have publicly sparred over access to and release of Epstein-related materials. Some Republican lawmakers have been accused by critics of slowing or blocking efforts to compel broader disclosure, while others argue that legal constraints, privacy considerations, and ongoing investigative sensitivities complicate blanket release. At various moments, public officials have pledged transparency, suggesting that lists or files would be made available. Subsequent statements appeared to walk back or reinterpret those promises, leading to confusion over what documents exist, what has already been unsealed through court proceedings, and what remains under seal. Supporters of the administration contend that much of the publicly demanded material is either already released through litigation or does not exist in the sweeping form described online. Critics counter that inconsistencies in messaging erode trust and feed suspicions that politically damaging information is being withheld. The controversy is further inflamed by unresolved questions surrounding Ghislaine Maxwell, who was convicted in federal court for her role in facilitating Epstein's trafficking of minors. Maxwell is currently serving a lengthy prison sentence following her 2021 conviction. Speculation, largely driven by commentary and hypothetical questioning at press briefings, has arisen about whether any form of executive clemency could be considered. The White House has not announced any pardon or commutation, and no formal clemency action has occurred. Nonetheless, the mere suggestion of such a possibility has drawn fierce backlash from survivors' advocates and lawmakers across the political spectrum. In the American constitutional system, the presidential pardon power is broad, rooted in Article 2, and historically controversial in high-profile cases. Critics argue that clemency for individuals convicted of trafficking crimes would contradict public commitments to combating exploitation. Supporters of strong executive discretion emphasize that hypothetical discussions do not equate to policy decisions. Yet politically and morally, the optics of even entertaining the notion have proven explosive. Beyond the Epstein-related disputes, allegations of financial impropriety have surfaced involving senior officials in the Department of Homeland Security. Secretary Kristi Noem, a former governor, has faced scrutiny from critics who question whether contracts and public funds have been directed toward firms with political or personal connections. Publicly available contracting records show that government agencies routinely engage private consulting and communications firms, a common practice across administrations. The controversy centers on whether specific awards created conflicts of interest due to prior campaign relationships or personal associations. Watchdog groups have called for audits and transparency, arguing that even the appearance of favoritism can undermine public confidence. Supporters of the department respond that procurement processes follow established legal guidelines, include competitive bidding where required, and are subject to internal ethics review. To date, no court has issued a finding of criminal wrongdoing in connection with these claims, but calls for investigation continue. These overlapping controversies, judicial rebukes, disputes over sealed records, clemency speculation, and procurement questions feed into a larger narrative advanced by some members of Congress that oversight mechanisms are being weakened or resisted. Lawmakers critical of the administration argue that subpoenas have been ignored or contested, that document requests are met with delay, and that executive privilege is invoked too expansively. The administration and its allies counter that interbranch disputes over information are routine and frequently resolved through negotiation or litigation. Historically, clashes between Congress and the executive over subpoenas have occurred under presidents of both parties, often culminating in court battles that clarify the limits of privilege and oversight. The legal architecture underlying these fights is complex. The Constitution establishes 3 co-equal branches, but it does not provide a precise roadmap for every confrontation. When Congress demands records and the executive refuses, courts may be asked to intervene, though judges often encourage political branches to negotiate. When judges issue injunctions blocking executive actions, appeals may quickly escalate to higher courts, including the Supreme Court. Each ruling shapes precedent incrementally, influencing how future administrations interpret their authority. Thus, what appears to some as a constitutional crisis may to others resemble the messy but functional operation of checks and balances. Still, language matters. When federal judges describe executive behavior as setting aside the rule of law far too commonly, those words resonate. Judicial opinions are typically restrained. Pointed phrasing signals genuine concern. Whether such concern reflects systemic overreach or sharp disagreement over statutory interpretation depends in part on one's legal philosophy. Originalists, textualists, and advocates of a more expansive view of executive power often diverge sharply in their readings of the same clause. Public perception, however, rarely parses doctrinal nuance. It absorbs headlines and quotations, forming impressions about institutional integrity. The Epstein dimension adds emotional intensity. Crimes involving sexual exploitation provoke rightful outrage, and survivors' voices have reshaped national conversations about accountability. Any suggestion that political considerations might impede full transparency or justice heightens suspicion. Yet, it is equally important to distinguish between documented facts, unresolved allegations, and speculative leaps. Multiple courts have unsealed portions of Epstein-related records over time. Other materials remain sealed due to privacy protections for victims or third parties. The debate over what should be released and under what redactions continues in legal filings rather than press conferences. parallel, accusations of corruption within federal departments underscore the broader theme of accountability. Federal ethics laws, inspector general offices, and congressional committees exist precisely to investigate such claims. Whether ongoing inquiries substantiate wrongdoing or ultimately clear officials, the process itself reflects the constitutional design. Allegations prompt scrutiny, scrutiny prompts evidence, evidence informs conclusions. The durability of democratic governance depends less on the absence of controversy than on the presence of mechanisms capable of addressing it. The convergence of these issues, executive authority, judicial pushback, high-profile criminal associations, and financial oversight, creates a combustible political environment. Critics argue that the pattern reveals erosion of norms. Supporters argue that the system is functioning as intended, with each branch asserting its prerogatives. The truth may lie in the tension itself. Democracies are stress-tested not when institutions agree, but when they collide. The American system was engineered for friction. What remains to be seen is whether that friction produces clarification and reform, or further polarization and distrust. Ultimately, the stakes extend beyond any single figure or file. They touch on fundamental questions. How transparent must government be when allegations implicate powerful individuals? How far does executive discretion extend in matters of enforcement and clemency? When judges issue repeated rebukes, does that signal abuse or healthy oversight? And when Congress investigates, or declines to, what does that reveal about political incentives and constitutional duty? Allegations of corruption escalate sharply with claims involving Tom Homan, a former senior immigration enforcement official often associated with hardline border policies. According to testimony cited by critics, Homan was allegedly implicated in a covert operation in which an undercover federal agent documented an exchange of cash connected to promised influence over contracts or enforcement decisions. These claims, described as involving tens of thousands of dollars in alleged bribes, have circulated in political commentary and activist circles. However, as of this writing, no court has convicted Homan of such conduct, and no publicly released indictment substantiates the specific accusation described in that testimony. Supporters dismiss the narrative as politically motivated or unverified, while critics argue that the mere existence of such allegations warrants transparent investigation. The larger controversy hinges not only on the alleged conduct itself, but on what followed. Claims that the Department of Justice curtailed or declined to pursue the matter, and that congressional oversight committees failed to initiate hearings. If true, critics argue, that sequence would represent a breakdown of accountability. If untrue or incomplete, it illustrates how rapidly unproven claims can harden into public perception, absent clear institutional communication. Attention then shifts to Ed Martin, described by detractors in congressional testimony as a partisan operative embedded within the Department of Justice. Critics allege that Martin has played overlapping advisory or legal roles aimed at advancing litigation strategies aligned with the president's political interests. Some opponents have gone further, using inflammatory labels to characterize his past activism, particularly his presence at events connected to the January 6, 2021 Capitol unrest. It is important to note that political rhetoric in congressional settings can be sharp and accusatory. Descriptive terms used in hearings do not constitute judicial findings. No federal court has convicted Martin of insurrection-related crimes. The broader issue raised by watchdog groups is structural rather than personal, whether the Department of Justice is being deployed in ways that blur the line between legitimate legal advocacy and partisan enforcement. The Justice Department, by long-standing norm, operates with a measure of independence from direct White House political direction. When that independence is questioned, regardless of which party controls the executive branch, concern tends to ripple across the legal community. The phrase weaponizing justice has become a rallying cry on both sides of the aisle. Some Republicans argue that prior administrations used federal investigations to target political opponents. Some Democrats counter that the current administration pressures prosecutors to pursue critics while slowing or declining inquiries that might implicate allies. Historically, accusations of politicized justice are not new. They have surfaced in controversies ranging from Watergate to debates over special counsels. The durability of public trust depends on transparent procedures, documented evidence, and judicial oversight rather than on partisan assurances alone. Simultaneously, policy debates over federal law enforcement funding have intensified. Proposals from certain Republican lawmakers have included reducing the size or budget of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, restructuring or limiting the authority of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and reevaluating grant programs that support hate crime enforcement and community violence prevention. Advocates of these reductions argue that bureaucratic reform and fiscal restraints are necessary to curb what they view as mission creep or politicization within federal agencies. Opponents argue that cutting investigative staff and grant funding undermines public safety and leaves local communities without critical resources. The debate often turns on competing visions of federalism, how much responsibility should reside in national agencies versus state and local authorities. Critics frame the contradictions starkly. They argue that politicians who campaign on law and order while simultaneously proposing budget cuts to federal law enforcement risk weakening the very institutions responsible for combating organized crime, cyber threats, terrorism, and interstate trafficking. Supporters respond that reform is not the same as abandonment and that decentralizing certain functions could enhance accountability. Budget negotiations, as always, are complex. Headline figures rarely capture the detailed reallocations within appropriations bills. What emerges from this convergence of allegations and policy fights is a deeper anxiety about equal application of the law. When subpoenas are contested, investigations appear stalled, or high-profile figures avoid charges despite public controversy, citizens may question whether power insulates individuals from scrutiny. Conversely, when investigations proceed aggressively against political actors, others question whether prosecution is being used as a political instrument. The constitutional system attempts to mediate these tensions through layered safeguards: inspectors general, congressional oversight, independent counsels where authorized, judicial review, and ultimately electoral accountability. It is essential, however, to distinguish between allegation and adjudication. Congressional testimony places claims into the public record, but it does not substitute for evidentiary standards in court. Media reports amplify assertions, but they do not determine guilt. The presumption of innocence remains foundational. At the same time, credible allegations involving public officials merit thorough, impartial investigation. Transparency in explaining why cases move forward or do not is critical to sustaining public confidence. The broader narrative advanced by critics is that a pattern has emerged: alleged misconduct, followed by institutional hesitation, followed by political deflection. Supporters of the administration counter with a different pattern: politically motivated accusations amplified before evidence is tested, followed by exoneration or procedural dismissal. These dueling narratives compete in real time, shaping public opinion before definitive findings are reached. In the end, the central issue transcends individual names. It concerns whether constitutional guardrails remain strong enough to ensure that no official, regardless of rank, party, or proximity to power, is beyond scrutiny. The American framework anticipates conflict among branches. It relies on ambition counterbalancing ambition. Courts issue opinions, Congress investigates or legislates, the executive defends its prerogatives, voters render judgment at the ballot box. The vitality of the rule of law depends not on the absence of controversy, but on the consistent, transparent functioning of these mechanisms. When lawmakers declare, "The evidence is on the record and the American people are watching," they invoke that democratic feedback loop. Records must be examined carefully. Evidence must be weighed. Allegations must be tested. If wrongdoing is proven, accountability must follow. If accusations collapse under scrutiny, reputations must be restored. In that disciplined process, rather than in rhetoric alone, lies the measure of whether the rule of law continues to apply equally to the powerful and the powerless.